Welcome back to part 8 of the series, How the Church Started, Where the Church Began. It's a portion of a bigger series I'm putting together called History of the Church and Related Questions. I'm just going to have a few more videos sort of related to this, going to just explain a little more of the history of the Dark Ages, what would happen, the development of the Holy Roman Empire, and take you up to the Reformation. And then the series I have on the Reformation is going to be very informative, I think. And so I just want to really encourage you to check those out if you're interested in learning about the Reformation. And specifically learning about the Reformation will help us understand sort of how all the different denominations we have today sort of branched off and started. Here we go, part 8. Left off in the last video sort of talking about the massive destruction of the Roman Empire. You have, just imagine the United States. Imagine if there was a nuclear war and the United States completely overnight or within a few weeks all the states broke away, where there was massive civil war between Vermont and New York, and no way for anyone from New York to communicate with California, and all the communication was knocked out, and all the power grid was knocked out, so you have no running water, we have no power, 2/3 of the people are dead because of plague or death or war, where there's massive corruption, massive brutal fatalities, people dying day in and day out, where the entire country is just a complete anarchist chaos, disaster, going crazy, with no central government, and just these little mini governments trying to start and protect themselves, but unable, and some of the states trying to communicate with the others, but just, can you imagine the disaster this would happen if this took place over the course of a couple weeks, and if this went on for 100 or so years? Literally within a generation or two, we'd lose all of our technology. I mean, chemistry the only time the information we have in chemistry, all the information we have about chemistry, the only reason it would be passed on is if everyone who knows about chemistry was able to survive and pass on the information to the next generation and give them the books and the text to pass on to the next generation and teach them about it. But if all the chemists are dead, or most of them are dead and don't have the time or the ability or the resources or the infrastructure to pass on the information, and most of the books are destroyed and burned, or lots of it are lost, then what you end up having is you lose a lot of technology. You lose a lot of it. No one, we may know a ton about chemistry today, but if that were to happen in our lifetime, a nuclear war, 100 years from now, they wouldn't know jack squat about chemistry. It was very possible. Or it's possible they might rise up and maybe be great. Who knows? But what happened in the Roman Empire is this disaster. And so this is what's going on in 500 AD. And you have this massive infighting, which also begin to have between 465 AD, when the fall of the Western Roman Empire falls, up until the year 1000. You've got a new religion on the scene that starts in the Middle East, in the Eastern nations, known as Islam. And Islam is a fierce, brutal religion. Islam, the Quran says things like, you tell people to become Muslim. If they don't convert, you kill them. You just kill them on the spot. That was the deal. There was a saying that even today is chanted by some Muslims in the Muslim world, that says, today we worship on Friday, tomorrow Saturday, and then following on Sunday. And what they mean by that is we worship on Friday. The Jews worship on Saturdays. The Christians worship on Sundays. That today we worship on Friday. Tomorrow we're going to kill the Jews, and then finally we'll kill the Christians. And the Quran, which is their holy book, refers to Christians and Jews as infidels. Anyone who doesn't want to convert. And so the Islam, from the Middle East, you have these empires, very strong, growing very quickly. The Arab nations, they develop a lot of technology. A lot of the technology that had been lost in Rome were in books, in libraries, hidden away in different portions all throughout the Middle East. And the Arabs began to find a lot of these and rediscover a lot of the things that the Roman Empire had developed. Things like sanitation, roads. They developed the number 0, which may seem like a simple thing, but the number 0 revolutionizes mathematics. It revolutionizes coming up the numbers. It revolutionizes all kinds of things in currency and in business. And you see the rise of these monarch empires from the East that are Islamic, and their goal is to convert everyone to Islam, and if not, then they wipe them out. And they were brutal, and they began to murder and kill, and they began to come in and take over what was known as the Byzantine Empire, which had formerly been the Eastern Roman Empire, which had sort of had this weird mixture of very, very legalistic Greek Orthodox Christianity. But the Turks came in from the east and began to take over what was the Byzantine Empire. And there's this massive war begins to fight and battle. And eventually the Muslims take over much of the Holy Land, which was Jerusalem and Israel and some of those nations, and begin to take over Turkey, what is modern-day Turkey, and Ephesus, and those nations of Eastern, sort of modern-day Eastern Europe, and all of the Middle East. The Muslim nation takes over. And till this day, that is much of that is considered the Muslim world. And that's sort of what happens there. On the west, what you have is all these little churches that are popping up, as I described in a previous video, that are very, very politically based, and they're in cahoots with some of the governors. And then you have all sorts of wars fighting. Then you have, sometimes you have one emperor of one small portion of like the kingdom of Burgundy or the kingdom of one other portion, maybe of Italy. The emperor of Italy would rise up and would be able to then take over. So every couple hundred years you have an emperor of one little area rising up and taking over a bunch of other lands and countries that used to be part of the Roman Empire, but you never have them all together. So it falls in 456, but from 456 AD all the way up to about 800 AD, you have 350 years where there's this massive political influx, constant changing. The borders of nations change, it seems like every year. All kinds of changes. And eventually all this political infighting, but eventually what you have, this one guy comes to power named Charlemagne, right around 800 AD, and the Pope, who was the Bishop of Rome at this time, remember, so they used the same infrastructure, wherever the Bishop of Rome. And by this point, some point around 500, right around 600 AD, some of the Catholic priests and Catholic historians had gone back and listed all the guys who had at one point had been the leaders of the Church of Rome. And they claim that Peter, because he was executed there back in, before he was killed back in the first century, Peter, the Apostle Peter, since he had been sort of the leader of the church in Rome while he was there for a few years before he was executed, they called him, they retroactively sort of went back and made a list of all the leaders and said, well, Paul was the first, and then the second, and then Clement, the guy I talked about Clement in a previous video, I talked quite a bit about Clement, they listed him as the fourth bishop of Rome. And they listed all the bishops of Rome going all the way back to the first century, right around 500 or 600 AD, somewhere in that time period. And they began to and this is the time period where you begin to see the title Pope assigned to every person who is the Bishop of Rome. And the Pope oversees all the churches. So even though the Roman Empire had fallen apart, a lot of the churches throughout the world were still loyal to the Bishop of Rome, which was now called the Pope. And today he's still called the Pope. What you also see, though, during these dark ages, this is called the Dark Ages. It's just a very, very dark time in human history. You also see these monasteries popping up of Catholic priests who genuinely love God, who were not corrupt, were not immoral. They were probably just hated what had happened to the church and the devastation of how true Christianity seemed to die. And by 700 or 800 AD, there were so few true Christians. Most of the true Christians had been murdered and killed, and most of the people who called themselves Christians were people just looking for political power, and this disastrous mess that was going on in Europe with the plagues and the wars and the political infighting. But you see popping up all over Europe these little monasteries of priests who become monks. They would go away in these monasteries and live by themselves, hid away, and they were the only ones to learn how to read and write. And and these are the ones that kept historical documents. They kept the biblical documents. They were the ones that were devoted to education, to language, and mathematics. But they hid away to try to preserve, and they would save the information. They would try to protect it from they wouldn't live near the cities because it was too dangerous. They would go far, far away in the middle of the wilderness in these little monasteries by themselves and try to preserve. And we see these little pockets of Catholic priests who are true Christians, who truly, truly love God, who wrote a lot of great, great writings. Guys like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas and others of that time period that develop a great, great, rich tradition from which the Reformation ends up being built on. In the next video, I'm going to cover a little bit on the Crusades and the Holy Roman Empire.